Today, my topic is colonial dietary encounters. This topic sits between our previous topic of the colonial period and our upcoming topic of foodways. What happens when worlds collide? I'll be looking at several different stories or viewpoints. These will involve people's beliefs about what constitutes food, foodways, or food in a social and cultural setting, food's effect on body, on people, and food identity, colonialism and diet, somewhat from both sides of the coin. To set the scene, between 1515 and 1715, when the Spanish, French, and British were vying for control of South Carolina, local Indians were forced into making choices about which of their traditions were important or expedient to maintain, and these included choices about their diet. I will tell this by telling you 5 different vignettes, or short stories. These will be stories in order: the Spanish colonist in South Carolina in the early to mid-16th century, the English colonist in Virginia in the early 17th century, the French colonist in Louisiana in the 18th century, the English colonist at Charleston in the late 18th century, and the effects of colonization on the South Carolina Indian diet, the 16th through the 18th centuries. So what does happen to people's diets when two worlds collide? We have colonial South Carolina, 1515 to 1715. During this time period, the Spanish attempted to colonize. They made forays along the coast between 1515 to 1587, and they reached the interior of South Carolina between 1540 and 1628. The French began explorations in 1524 and made a colonization attempt in 1562. British exploration began along the coast in 1663, and their first colonization at Charlestown began in 1670. And then we have Indians coming from elsewhere in the United States, and here I represent them by one of the most famous, the Westo Indians, who settled along the Savannah River between 1659 and 1680. I begin with the premise that people prefer to eat their traditional diet, that it's very difficult to change people's dietary habits, what they consider to be food, and what tastes good to them. So, I need to talk about what were people's diets like before this collision. The first vignette involves the Spanish. Recall, they first arrived on the South Carolina coast in 1515, and they actually settled with hundreds of people in Santa Elena between 1566 and 1587. The Spanish came to South Carolina with a preference for eating wheat bread, olive oil, wine, and mutton. And they had a religious need for wheat wafers and wine. Therefore, they felt deprived when, by necessity, they instead had to eat cornbread and fish here in South Carolina. Spanish settlements and forts were supposed to be self-sufficient, raising their own food. In practice, they depended on shipped provisions as well as food from Indians. The Spanish colonists did raise Old World animals that they had brought with them, such as pigs, chickens, and cows. These are all animals that could survive with minimal care. But for meat, they depended upon local fish and shellfish, and secondarily on wild game, such as deer, wild bird, and turtles. At Santa Elena, most of the settlers' plant-based diet consisted of local indigenous crops, such as maize, beans, and squash, wild nuts, such as hickory and acorn, and fruits. Some Old World crops that they had available to them were ones that could be grown locally, and these consisted mainly of peach, fig, melon, and watermelon. And only rarely, in less than 17% of the examples, could they eat imported foods that they preferred, such as wheat, olives, European wine grapes, and hazelnuts. The second vignette is looking at the British Jamestown colony, settled in the early 17th century along the coast of Virginia, founded in May of 1607 by over 100 English colonists. These colonists were sent with limited provisions, and in the first year people went hungry and many controversies arose over food. Today, you might ask, why did starving colonists refuse to eat maize from local Indians? And why did they turn down wild foods, such as venison? They called such food savage trash. They'd rather starve than eat it. The British who settled in Virginia at the beginning of the 17th century arrived from England with very definite ideas about proper diet. Their ideas were based on the idea that humans reflected the four humors of nature. They believed that their identity depended on what they ate. You ate food befitting your status, and the food you ate affected your mental, physical, moral, and spiritual qualities. So maintaining social order depended in part on maintaining the proper diet for your social status. A change in the diet meant a change in the person. The more different the diet, the greater the degree of change in the person. This idea arose out of the broad metaphysical theory that the entire universe is composed of four immaterial qualities: hot, cold, moist, and dry. These qualities combined and appeared in physical form as the four elements of earth, air, water, and fire. Every human was seen as a miniature reflection of the universe, that is, a microcosm within the macrocosm. Human temperament depended on the ratio of the four humors and was the foundation of the philosophy of the humoral body. The humors were choler, hot and dry, represented by a circle of fire; blood, warm and moist, represented by air; phlegm, cold and moist, represented by water; and melancholy, cold and dry, represented by earth. Eating foods other than the customary diet for one meal or one day prompted small, fleeting changes. But a long-term radical dietary change, that's another story. To achieve virtue, you needed to strive for the golden mean. That is, health as a balance in the center between the extremes, between cold, hot, wet, and dry. Few people are born with the golden mean or with virtue, but you could work to acquire it by living a lifestyle that fostered it. Food was the most important vehicle for achieving balance in the golden mean. All foods were classified to 6 degrees of heat and moisture. Food was used as the building blocks of the body. The amount and proportions of food eaten affected your humoral balance. People identified 5 elementally hot tastes: hot, sweet, salty, bitter, or sharp, and 3 elementally cold tastes: rough, sour, and harsh. Food texture also mattered. For example, light and delicate, such as white bread, or dense and heavy, such as artisan bread. Lighter food formed highly refined people, whereas coarse food made a person coarse and unable to achieve the golden mean. Thus, the perceived qualities of the food transferred to the eater. This philosophy of food affected the social structure of early modern England. English identity tied to a common diet: bread, pottage, meat, fish, dairy products, fruits, and vegetables. But people of the higher status ate better quality food, more variety, more refined, adequate quantity, and they were the only ones with continual food security. Thus, people of higher status were the only ones who could achieve virtue, and thus the only people fit to rule. To summarize, when English people first colonized America, they thought that people were what they ate, but they also needed to eat what they were. They held very definite ideas about proper diet based on the idea that humans reflected the 4 humors of nature. You ate food befitting your status, and the food you ate affected the physical, mental, moral, and spiritual qualities of the eater. Maintaining social order depended, in part, on maintaining the proper diet for your social status. So the Jamestown colonists experienced starvation in their first 20 years of settlement, due in no small part to their rigid ideas about who should farm, who should eat imported versus local foods, and their disdain of maize as a human rather than a livestock food. It was coarse. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct the face of a 14-year-old victim of cannibalism. She died naturally in the winter of 1609 of starvation, but her body was then eaten. About 80% of the colonists died that winter, and by the spring of 1610, about only 60 people remained alive. Now, they also had very definite ideas that only women could eat women bodies and only men could eat male bodies. The third vignette is about the French in 18th century Louisiana. Unlike the English settlers, why did the French value local foods and incorporate them into their cuisine? Food figured prominently and consciously in the mediation of the colonial encounter in 18th century Louisiana. French colonists in New Orleans positively valued exotic native resources while showing how easily local food could be civilized by French cooking practices. Pleasure and hospitality were vital to French and native interactions and to the reconstruction of Frenchness in the colonial capital of New Orleans. The French military officer Bossu spoke on the necessary etiquette of accepting the food offered by native hosts. During one visit, he says, I was brought persimmon bread, bear paws, and beaver tails. I also ate dog, though not through preference, but in order not to offend my hosts. I have made it a point to conform to the customs of the people with whom I have to live, and to assume their habits in order to gain their friendship. The politeness required of reciprocal hospitality provided a catalyst for the exchange of food ideas and the rapid adoption of new items in the diet. Such exchanges occurred in multiple directions. So the French were open to trying all of the local Indian foods. Some of these foods were valued as local equivalents of European foods, and others were savored for their exotic appearance and wild taste. Colonists took pride in their ingenuity in adopting local resources and molding them into something familiar by cooking them using French preparation methods. New World cooking ingenuity became an emblem of colonial accomplishment. The French ability to transform America into something civilized and consumable. In her analysis, Doughty summarizes, French colonists actively adopted native foods while constructing the taste experience as both strange and pleasurable. Simultaneously, they attempted to bring French foods and habits into their new environment. Their descriptions invoke a comparison between wild local Indian versus domesticated imported French. However, they did not do the same kind of adoption of foods from their African slaves. They considered exotic ingredients to be tamed by using them in traditional French recipes such as breads, pâtés, and fricassees. And hospitality customs were important for the exchange of cultural food practices between Native Americans and Europeans, and for the social bonding of French colonizers, especially in New Orleans. The fourth vignette turns to the British settlement of Charleston in 1670. We have over a dozen translated accounts, letters, or advertising pamphlets about South Carolina dating between 1664 and 1712. And these provide crucial information for untangling the complex introductions and reintroductions of European plant crops. Between 1670 and 1712, the colonists in Charlestown planted numerous trees and vine fruits or nuts that they had introduced from elsewhere, along with herbs, vegetables, grains, pulses, tobacco, and other staples such as hemp and flax. Here is a list of some of the accounts, letters, and advertising pamphlets, beginning with a Spanish account, De Soto, French account, Laudonnière, and then the rest of these, of course, are from the British or English background. I list here some of the fruit trees that were introduced from elsewhere in the world to South Carolina. Of particular interest to me are the ones marked in yellow, peach and fig, both of which were introduced first by the Spaniards in the 1500s and were still around by 1670 or by 1664 for that matter, when the British were first exploring and settling the South Carolina coast. Other types of imported fruit have been mentioned a few times in these accounts. Grape, nectarine, cherry, lemon, olive, and white mulberry. I turn now to my final vignette, the South Carolina Indians between the 16th and 18th century. Given all of these colonial encounters, French, Spanish, British, Indians from elsewhere, how did the colonial encounters affect their diet? Remember, foodways are not easily changed. So when the Europeans came to North America, they brought with them new plant foods deliberately, new crops. They also unintentionally brought with them weeds in their animal fodder. Some plants became weeds and spread on their own. Some plants were passed from one Indian nation to another. Thus, an interior tribe could obtain European crops, not from the Europeans, but from other Indians. The Spanish brought plants from all around the world, from South America, the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, Florida, the Southwest, and Europe. The British, who had strong ties with the West Indies, brought plants from the Barbados, and also from England and from the Jamestown colony in Virginia. Plants were also already being grown by local Indians prior to Euro-American contact. They had long been obtaining plants through direct trade and plants through down-the-line trade. But once the Europeans were here, they could also obtain new types of plants that had escaped from Euro-American cultivation, and plants brought by colonizing Indians. South Carolina Indians had previous dietary changes before the arrival of Europeans. What was their diet during the late woodland, from about AD 500 to 950? Well, they were depending on wild nuts such as hickory and acorn, but they were supplementing this with maize and some squash, so they were growing some crops. But in the early Mississippian, we see a new suite of cultivated crops called the Eastern Agricultural Complex, that is, maygrass and quinoa pod, pictured here. So they continued to eat wild nuts, especially acorn, and after that hickory, and maize. But by late Mississippian, we see mostly maize and a little bit of maygrass or quinoa pod, and a greater variety of wild nuts. Thomas Ashe, in advertising the English colony at Charlestown, wrote in 1682, "Their diet is of fish, flesh, and fowl, with Indian maize or corn. Their drink, water." I've examined plant remains from several colonial age Indian sites in South Carolina, the earliest of which is BK 1633, just outside of Charleston, and whose settlement ended just prior to the settlement of Charleston itself. Next, the Mulberry site in central South Carolina, dating to about 1680, and two colonial period sites, one associated with the Catawba, one associated with the Apalachicola. Recall that the Spanish arrived in 1521 and was around in the state up until 1587, including several hundred colonists living at Santa Elena on the Port Royal Sound between 1566 and 1587. The French were here between 1562 and 1563, a very short-lived time of colonization also in the Port Royal Sound, indicated here with the yellow dot. Colonizing Indians also came from the north, from the west, from the Midwest. And the British began their explorations in 1663, starting at Port Royal Sound and working their way northward to where they settled in what became known as Charlestown. So we have the British settlement of 1670 of about 130 or a few more colonists. Within 30 years, there were over 4,000 settlers. And by 1710, the majority of the population along the coast was still Indians, followed by black slaves and only 12% Euro-Americans. Based on the recovered archaeological plant remains from those 4 areas that I showed you on the map, between 1640 and 1715, Indians along the South Carolina coast and far in the interior continued traditional reliance on their own crops and wild plants. Chris Gramion has outlined what European introduced crops the Indians were most likely to adopt. They were most likely to adopt a crop that tasted good but wasn't critical to their diet. That is, it didn't initially supply a major portion of calories. They were also likely to adopt something that could be grown and cooked in ways that were already familiar to the adopter, and something that didn't conflict with other important scheduled duties. In general, the crops adopted the earliest were the watermelon, the peach, and the cowpea, and all 3 of these had been brought to the southeastern coast, specifically to South Carolina, by the Spanish in the early 1500s. And these plants may have been adopted by Indians who never had direct contact with the Spanish. I'll explain more about that in a minute. When exploring the coast for where to place the town of Charlestown, Hilton described the Port Royal area. The country abounds with grapes, large figs, and peaches. Grapes, of course, were native to South Carolina, but figs and peaches were not, and had been brought here by the Spanish more than 75 years before. In describing an Indian town on Paris Island, Sanford said, "I saw here beside the great number of peaches, which the more northerly places do also abound in, some store of fig trees, very large and fair, both fruit and plants." On St. Helena Island, one of the explorers wrote, "Many of us went ashore at St. Helena and brought back word that the land was good land, supplied with many peach trees and a competence of timber, a few fig." So fig had been introduced by the Spanish. Fig seeds, which are quite small, had been recovered from Santa Elena, dating between 1577 and 1587. And obviously, from these historic accounts that I've just related, it continued to grow wild in the area between 1664 and 1666, before British settlement, but during British exploration. And the colonists in Charlestown also brought in and grew figs. Peach also was introduced by the Spanish. It's been recovered from Santa Elena, dating to 1577 to 1587. And in Florida, it was common in the Spanish missions after 1560. Pictured here is a peach seed from the Daniel Island site, BK 1633, just outside of Charleston. Peach trees are weedy and they spread easily. I can speak from experience that they can fruit in 3 to 5 years from a seed. Cowpea also was introduced by the Spanish, and it's been found at the Daniel Island BK 1633 site along the central South Carolina coast that dated between 1590 and 1670. It made it inland to central Alabama among the Fusahachie by 1670, and to eastern Tennessee by the late 1700s. Keeping in mind that Gremillion hypothesized that the Indians were most likely to adopt tasty foods that could be prepared in ways in which the Indians already knew how to prepare other foods, what well-established Indian food was the preparation of peaches based on? We find charred peach seeds at these historic sites that I've already mentioned. I used to think that the Indians were basing their use of peaches on the previous use of the wild plums that grew here in the Southeast, but we rarely find charred plum seeds at archaeological sites. This led me to figure out that they most likely were using peaches the same way that the Indians had previously been preparing persimmons for food. One way to prepare or to preserve persimmons is to make a fruit leather by mashing up the fruit, either removing the seeds or not removing the seeds, drying it in the sun, and you end up with a kind of what today we call a fruit roll-up, dried fruit that can be preserved and eaten later at a later date. In summary, based on the recovered plant remains between 1640 and 1715, Indians along the South Carolina coast and far into the interior continued traditional reliance on their own crops and wild plants, despite all these many colonial European encounters. But they supplemented their diet with weedy or easily grown introduced domesticates, such as cowpea, watermelon, and peach. And speaking about peach, the people at the Daniel Island BK 1633 site evidently were growing peach prior to the colonization of Charlestown. Therefore, their peaches must have come from the wild peaches left over from Spanish occupation over 75 years before. So I take this as evidence for indirect appropriation of a crop from the Spanish without ever having had direct contact with the Spanish themselves. Although the changes in the types of plant foods appear minor, it's likely that seasonal timing associated with plant cultivation and collection, an emphasis on what was grown or collected, and even the ratios of dietary plant food items changed. And we cannot assume that meat in the diet remained the same. Unfortunately, animal bones preserve very poorly in the acidic soils of South Carolina and the Southeast in general, and therefore we don't know so much about the meat compared to what we know about the plant remains in the diet. Based on historic documents, like the Spanish before them, the earliest British colonists depended on Indian crops, particularly maize. They acquired plant foods from the local Indians, and they imported plants from their colony in Virginia. They also grew other non-local crops that they had brought with them. And they received supplies by ship of other non-local crops, mostly from Barbados. However, during the early colonial period, when it came to plant foods, Indian knowledge affected the Europeans much more than European foods affected Indians. The paleoethnobotanical remains that I spoke about were recovered thanks to these entities. And if you'd like to read the sources of some of what I spoke about today, please look these up.